Hey guys, so this video is going to be a little bit different. For those of you who don't know, I wrote a book, and this is going to be me reading the first 5 chapters of that book. And so just right off the bat, I'm not a professional narrator. It's just kind of a fun little thing that I did, so this should not be considered a professional grade audiobook. It's just kind of a fun little thing that I decided to do. In chapter 2, that's probably the longest chapter of this particular section. It jumps around a lot, like chronologically, and so on the page it makes sense because it's broken up by squiggly little lines, but you can't really break that up in an audio format, so I didn't really know how to do that. So basically, there's a sound of a clock winding up, and so it's weird, but whenever you hear that, just know like, okay, there's a time jump. Also in chapter 2, there is a character that speaks Japanese. And my pronunciation of Japanese is not very good, so for that I just kind of cut it away to an automated bot that speaks Japanese. So the pronunciation is good, but it's going to be a little bit jarring, switching between my voice and the voice of a bot. On that note, this is kind of a proof of concept. The book is written, and you can buy it, and the links in the description and all that. But I was going to I have a GoFundMe for this book. I was going to re-edit it and then also get a new cover and probably pay for a professional audiobook as well. And then also that same GoFundMe will help pay for the 2 sequels of this book as well. So if you're interested in that, click the link in the description to find out more. And without further ado, here's the story. Magic Hands, Part 1, The End. Written by Luke Kenneth Xavier. Hevel, saith Kohelet, all is Hevel. Kohelet 1-2, OJB. Chapter 1. It's true what they say. Anesthesia is one hell of a drug. Even anesthesia for a procedure as benign as sticking a camera down her throat to visualize the issues caused Jackie Abrams to miss one tiny event. She had slept through the end of the world. The only reason she'd woken up at all was because her IV had completely dried up, and all the good stuff was completely gone. Even after her body was awake, it took her mind even longer to fully surface. She still had the tube in her mouth. All the power in the hospital was dead, and something, somewhere, was burning. She took a moment to thank God she was not wearing a Johnny gown. That would have made things a bit more complicated. Instead, she was wearing skinny jeans and a Jurassic Park t-shirt. Jackie had never seen any of those movies, but her out-of-touch mother gave it to her for a Christmas present a few years earlier. She tried calling out, but that did nothing because she had a tube down her throat. She looked around for something to throw. The only thing within her reach was the IV pole, which had the empty bag of anesthetic that fed her hand through the IV tubing. Surgical tape, in her opinion, was one of the strongest substances in the world. If she was going to make a sound loud enough to get someone's attention, she'd have to throw the IV pole against the wall. In summary, the only thing to get her out of the situation was to remove the surgical tape from her hand. She tried to picking at it with her fingernails, but that seemed to do less than nothing. She paused for a moment, a single tear sliding down her left cheek. Maybe she didn't have to remove the IV. Maybe all she had to do was remove the tube in her throat. She could haul the IV pole around with her until she found someone to help her. She placed her non-IV hand on the tube in her mouth. It was anchored on either side by a band tied around the back of her head. She followed it the rest of the way with her eyes, but unfortunately the end of the tube was attached to a large machine at the far end of the room. She took a deep breath, but that didn't work. She took a deep breath through her nose, and that was a bit better. But there was no hope of the tube coming out of that machine, but there was a chance it could come out of her mouth. She didn't have the tools necessary to remove it the right way, yet she thought that she might be able to brute force this thing out. She used her fingernails to pick at the band tied around her face. She made pretty good progress until her fingernails slipped and gouged her cheek. She gasped in shock, which was not a great thing to do with the camera in her stomach. She started heaving. No, 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 she thought to herself. You can throw up afterwards. But her mouth was too busy to throw up. The only upside of being in this situation was that she simply could not throw up. The downside was, of course, she could gag and cough, which she did. A lot. And after all that was over, she snorted a couple of times just to make sure. She lied back and rested for a few moments. This was tiring work. She got to work again on the band around her face. She tried to start all over again on the other cheek because she did not want to make the slash any deeper than it already was. She moved a lot slower this time because she did not want matching scars on each cheek. Eventually, she tore through the band. She took both sides of the band and held it in front of her face. The easiest part was done. The band holding the camera tube was in place was off, and the tube was now able to move freely. Now all she had to do was blindly pull out the tube that was inside of her, with the added bonus that if she did it wrong, she could cause permanent internal damage. That seemed like a very likely outcome to Jackie. She was an English teacher, after all, not a doctor. She closed her eyes and slowly pulled it out. At first she gagged, but nothing came up. She didn't think there was anything left to come up anyway. The rest of the process was far less eventful. It was impossible to tell how long it took because all the power in the hospital was out. There were two voices in her head, competing for her attention. The first voice, the one belonging to the cool, collected English teacher, said, "Go slow. Take your time. If you go too fast, you may cause permanent internal damage." The second voice, a much louder, more animalistic, survivalist voice, was unfortunately the louder of the two. It said, "Go, go, go. Get this thing out of your body. Worry about damage some other time." Ultimately, she gave in to the second voice. When the tube came out, it seemed a lot smaller on the outside. She screamed. Her throat was very sore, so it came out more like a howl. But as far as she could tell, nobody heard her scream, which was bad, because as far as she could tell, no one else was in the hospital. The burning smell was a lot stronger now, giving off the aroma of overdone pork. Her uncle, who had been a firefighter for over 30 years, would have recognized the scent as that of burning human flesh. Jackie was on a roll, so instead of walking around with the IV rack, she wanted to ditch it, similarly to how she ditched the camera tube. She removed a bobby pin from her hair and dug furiously at the surgical tape on the back of her hand. Now there wasn't even a decision. She had completely given in to the second voice, and the first voice was neatly tucked away for later use. In the process of removing the tape, it seemed to her that she bloodied her hand even worse than she had bloodied her cheek, although it was hard to tell because there was still no power, and she could not see very well. Finally, she was able to stand up, free and fully uninhibited by anything other than her bloodied hand and cheek. She opened the door and left the room that had been her holding cell for an unknown amount of time. Could have been hours, days, or even weeks. She had no way of knowing. The hallway was lit only by a few smoldering fires, with a hole in the ceiling that let in some additional moonlight. Okay, so it's nighttime, she thought to herself. She tried to recall what time she had checked in, maybe around noon, but who knew if it was even the same day. That sounded right, although she did not know for sure. The anesthesia was still making things a little cloudy. It may not have sounded like much, but to Jackie, at least 6 hours was a huge step from not having any clue at all. The fires and moonlight gave the place a sort of ambiance reserved only for romantic dinners and witch burnings. There was a set of large double doors at the end of the hall. As Jackie approached, she could see something was written on, or more accurately, scratched into one of the doors. As she got closer, she could see that there was blood and little pieces of bone fragments inside the letters, as if someone had mutilated their own hand trying to write this message. This world is not safe anymore. This world? That would indicate that there's more than one, the voice of the English teacher stated. As if to drive home this point, whoever the writer was underlined the last word in their own blood. Jackie looked at the door for a moment. Was this world ever truly safe? Maybe whatever had caused the fires and made the hole in the roof had killed all the power, including the generator, and had made the before time seem safe in comparison. Was it still here? Behind those very doors, perhaps? No, she was only psyching herself out at this point. There was nothing here. She forced herself to open the door, with an added effort to avoid the blood, some of which now trailed down the door. When she opened the door, she was once again bombarded by that same burned pork smell. The smell was accompanied by a sound, the sad, small whimper of a doctor who knew he was going to die. Jackie guessed that this was, in its previous life, the waiting room. She could tell this by all the chairs that had been strewn about. The doctor in question was in the center of the room. His right leg had been burned off at the knee. His left leg was bent in a backwards J shape. She knew by looking at his hand that the message on the door belonged to him. The first two fingers on his left hand were worn down to stubs. He also confirmed this when he turned and said, "Jody, you came." The look in his eyes was faint and distant. "I'm Jackie." He jerked up, making eye contact with her and shaking his head. "Jody." Jackie was shocked by the sudden contrast this made, but she quickly understood. The man was about to die, yet despite this, he knew she wasn't actually Jody. Jody had probably been someone this man had loved very deeply. If she had to play the part of Jody to comfort this guy in his dying moments, so be it. She sat down on the floor next to him. "Did you write that on the door?" she asked. "This world is not safe anymore," he said. "Yes, I..." can read it, is what she was going to say, but she caught herself. That wasn't a nice thing to say, especially to a man who was about to die. Saw it. What does it mean? They came. Stole just about everything. It's a marvel that you survived. Who are you? The doctor shook his head. What do you mean by this world? Seemingly avoiding the question, he tapped his pocket, then pointed at a nearby cupboard. I think I'm going to punch my ticket early. He pulled 2 bottles of morphine out of his pocket. Could you grab me a clean needle from there, please? As she got up, he continued talking. 1 for me and 1 for you if you want it. She froze for a minute. Was she really about to partake in this man's suicide? If she chose not to join him, she would, at the very least, be assisting in this man's suicide. But she had an idea that stuff like that no longer mattered. It looks like there's only 1 left, and it looks like it's been used, she lied. There was a pause. It was long enough that Jackie had actually started her trek back. Well, bring it here. I'm dying anyway. This horrified her. They did this. They took my leg and they left me for dead. But that was not all they left me. One of their minds was bleeding. How could you tell his brain was bleeding? She asked. Not his brain, Jody, his mind. Okay, now Jackie knew this guy was crazy. I could see other things, places. It was horribly beautiful. The good doctor coughed up a big wad of blood. Quickly now, I haven't got much time. Jackie kneeled down next to him. Did you do this to yourself, or did they make you do it? She shifted her eyes to indicate the men's finger stubs. He looked at his hands with an expression of surprise, as if he just discovered he was missing digits. After a moment of confusion, he spoke. I did this. She handed him the syringe. He took the needle and rigged it up with the morphine. What does it all mean? She asked, as he injected himself. He let out a sigh of comfort. There are other worlds, then. She brushed this aside as the mad ramblings of a dying man. There was enough of the drug in there to put him to sleep immediately, but he lingered in this world just a little bit longer. He closed his eyes, and that was all. Elvis had left the building, and this world was now short 1 good doctor. She began to leave, then stopped, noticing the second bottle of morphine on the floor. The light from the dying fire reflected off the glass, giving it an evil look. And it was evil, after all, wasn't it? But how evil was it really? Could it be any worse than what was out there, the things that had caused all this? Bending over, she grabbed the bottle. She did not yet have any plans to kill herself, but if everything was as bad as she was being led to believe, maybe ODing wasn't the worst way to go out. Punching my own ticket is how the doctor had described it. She was not going to take the needle, however. She was going to find a new one someplace else. Chapter 2. It had been at least 2 days since Ronnie had left Las Vegas. After that, he'd stopped counting. At first, he tried sleeping during the day and walking at night, but that didn't work. Firstly, it was much too hot to be sleeping during the daytime. Next, his body was not able to do a whole 180 after sleeping for just about every night of his life. He was not able to merely flip a switch and say, we're going to sleep during the daytime now, okay? Besides, at this point, if someone wanted to come up on him while he slept during the night and kill him, well, Ronnie would have no objections. After all, he had killed plenty during his life. And after what had happened in Las Vegas, maybe it was his turn to be on the receiving end of that exchange. Ronnie was perched on a fire escape in an alley in East Las Vegas. Him and a handgun with a silencer attached to the end of it. When it came to guns, Ronnie didn't know a potato shooter from a rocket launcher. But he knew how to shoot, and more importantly, he knew how to kill. The Perez family, people who employed him most of the time and taught him everything he knew, were friends with a lot of people who were very knowledgeable when it came to handguns. But unfortunately, the family did not know many snipers, which is why Ronnie used a handgun instead of a rifle, which is what most people would have used in this situation. But that was okay, because as Mark just turned into the alley, he lived on the ground level of the apartment across the street from where Ronnie was perched. The guy must have had a lot of coffee or some other stimulant because he would not stay still. This was bad for Ronnie because he knew from experience that it was a lot harder to aim with a silencer. Ronnie jumped off the fire escape and landed on a dumpster just behind his target. The man turned and saw that Ronnie was holding a gun. Please, 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 you don't have to do this, the man said with unnatural calmness as Ronnie grabbed him by the shoulder and threw him to the ground. They were in an abandoned alley, so no one could see what happened next. No, you don't understand. I do. He pointed his gun toward the man. What happened next was very simple, yet somehow Ronnie found it so deeply unsettling. The man lied on the ground with his hands outstretched like someone preparing to make a snow angel, and never broke eye contact with Ronnie as he said, "Yes, I do understand. Death is not the end. You may kill me, but I will forgive you." He didn't beg for his life, and he didn't try to bring his wife into it. He just stood there and accepted what he could not change. In all his years as a hired killer, Ronnie had never seen anyone do that. There was something so inhuman about the whole thing, and that was what upset him. The most basic human desire is to not die, yet somehow this man was lying there and practically begging for the end. That was what Ronnie found so deeply disturbing. Been headed southeast alongside Arizona Highway 93 because that had seemed like a good as route as any at the time. He traveled next to the highway but never on it, mainly because there were too many pileups. The further away he went from Vegas, the more spaced out the cars were. Besides, on the off chance that there was someone still alive enough to use the roads, he didn't want to get hit. He had no problem being off in his sleep, but he also had no desire to be plowed down by a rogue Mercedes-Benz. The beginning of this day might have been day 3 or 4, maybe even 5, but Ronnie neither knew nor cared. He found an SUV in fairly good condition. Most of the cars had exploded, taking out chunks of the road with them. This car seemed to be in pretty okay condition. Front windshield and most of the windows were missing, and some of the tires were flat, but Ronnie had no intention of driving the thing. No, what he wanted was the contents of the vehicle. With most of the windows out, the interior of the car was well ventilated. He opened the rear passenger side door. He was greeted by a pink car seat and bags of luggage strewn about. Looked like a good old family vacation. Well, wherever they were now, they were probably not thinking about swimming pools and movie stars. He climbed inside the car. It did not take long for him to find what he was looking for: a 6-pack of Coca-Cola and an open box of fruit chews. He crawled into the front of the car and found a Gucci purse. He dumped out its contents. After placing the Coke and chews in the bag, he strapped it over his shoulder. It felt good to finally have something strapped on, even if it was only just a purse. He liked to have his gun strapped over his shoulder, but he didn't have it anymore. He had given it to his boss for cleaning back when the world was still normal. Both men stood in the alley, just for a moment, not doing anything. Then the man looked at the sky and muttered something that Ronnie would never forget. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Then Ronnie shot the man in the neck. Even though he was lying on the ground, his body was still rocked by the impact. As he lay on the ground shivering, a single tear rolled down his cheek, and he mouthed something that could have been "thank you" or "love you" or something else entirely. Ronnie was not going to stay and try to find out what it all meant. He wanted nothing more than to get out of Las Vegas and forget all about this guy. He holstered the gun under his jacket and walked away, leaving the guy to die alone in an alley. He arrived at the predetermined location, the parking lot of a fast food chain called A Boy and His Dog. A black BMW limousine was there waiting for him. He got in the back. "Sorry we're late, pal. Pinky wanted to go through the drive-thru," Chuck, Ronnie's handler, said, adjusting his rimless glasses. Chuck was a small, scrawny man, whereas Pinky, Chuck's bodyguard, was a bald block of a man. Ronnie handed his gun to Chuck, who took it and removed the magazine and its silencer. "It's no bother," Ronnie said. "I was running a little late myself." "Oh," Chuck tilted his head. "No harm done then." "Right." Ronnie shifted in his seat. "What's got you so uneasy, my guy?" Chuck said, folding his hands in his lap. "I don't know. I just want to get out of the city, I guess." Ronnie looked out the car window at the midsummer afternoon sky. No, Chuck laughed. No, Chuck laughed. "2 hits planned before you go on vacation, remember? What's got you so worked up anyway?" "Something about today's hit," Ronnie began, but Chuck interrupted him. Tss. "Say no more. In our line of work, 1 kill is nothing. Okay, you hear me? Nothing. Besides, I tell this to all my guys. We only kill the bad guys. We make the world better by taking out scum like," he waved his hand in the direction of Pinky. "Richard Bachman, sir," Pinky said. "Ah, yes, Richard Bachman. I have trouble remembering the names sometimes," Chuck said. Ronnie had no problem remembering the names. He never forgot any of the names of the people he killed. "This one was different, Chuck. He didn't beg for his life." Chuck shook his head. Some folks are crazy like that, I suppose. Ronnie sighed and looked at Pinky. What if we're the bad guys? Ah, get off it, Chuck laughed. Bad guys don't get paid as good as us. After what he assumed to be around noon, what was noon to someone alone in the dying world, Ronnie got down to rest. The Coke was a bit warm, but it still had its essential fizziness to it. The fruit chews were the kind that squirt juice out when you take a bite in them. The first time, it caught him off guard and startled him. Most of the chews were not too badly melted. As he was packing his leftovers back into the bag, he noticed something he forgot to remove. A black leather wallet and a pack of cigarettes. He opened the wallet and saw the owner's ID. The name was Diane Manson. She was 42 and a resident of Arizona. She had long black hair, but Ronnie noticed some snow was starting to show up on the mountain's peak. She and her family were probably headed back from Las Vegas when it happened. Ronnie formed a cross with the 2 lipstick cases and a rubber band and placed the ID at the foot of the cross. He poured out the rest of his Coke behind the cross and lit a cigarette. For Diane. He left and continued his journey to nowhere. Ronnie looked out the window. A giant ball of fire and electricity appeared in the sky. At first, Ronnie couldn't see the ball because its light was minimized by the brightness of the sun, but then it started shooting out bolts of pure energy similar to lightning. The bolts hit people, seemingly at random. One of the bolts hit the driver of the car that Ronnie was in. He started screaming. A bright green light from the front of the vehicle. Suddenly, the whole car went sideways. It got T-boned by several vehicles on both sides. Ronnie managed to climb out through one of the broken windows. As he made it into the median, the limo exploded, sending him to the ground. A brown El Camino went roaring past his head. After he stood up, he opened his jacket looking for his gun, but his holster was empty because he handed the gun back to Chuck. Damn! There were planes and helicopters falling out of the sky. Some were smashing into buildings while others crashed straight down to the ground. A gas station on the other side of town exploded. A huge car pileup formed into a mass of twisted metal and blood. Ronnie ran in the opposite direction. Stores were being vaporized by mostly green. Later, Ronnie would recall seeing some yellow ones as well. Lights. There was a small group of people huddling together in a nearby empty parking lot. Ronnie called out to them. Hey, excuse me, I need your help. That was an odd way of phrasing it. What he needed was more than help, but he felt safer in a group, nonetheless. One of the women in the group looked over at him. Although she was beyond frightened, there was something in her eyes that told Ronnie they were willing to help. Unfortunately, a bolt of fire, crackling with electricity, struck her right in the middle of her face. She began trembling violently and her skin began melting away. Make it stop! Make it stop! She screamed. Then, with a yell reserved for people that are no longer in control of their bodies, a bright yellow light shot out of her hands. Everyone in the vicinity, Ronnie was still too far away to have been affected in any harmful way, was thrown back. While most of them would have survived the blast, what killed them was the force of the impact. In a mess of blood and screams, the woman fled. One of her companions, a man of about 60, was impaled through the shoulder by a handicapped parking sign. Naturally, he was screaming bloody murder. The sign had completely cut through his arm, twisting backwards and only hanging on by the skin of his back. Ronnie could see the man's twisted muscles as unknown fluid oozed out. Help! Help me! The dying man yelled. Ronnie came over to the man before he knew he was dying. If Ronnie had known, he would have left him there. The man looked at Ronnie. Molly, is that you? The guy must have hit his head pretty hard. No, I'm not Molly. Let me find you some help. Ronnie got to his feet, but the man grabbed him with his good arm. No, stay here. The man was crying now. I can't help you. The man paid no mind. Is there something after? Do we go on? An ancient eagerness entered the man's eyes. I don't know. Ronnie lowered his head, and his mind went back to Richard Bachman. And for the first time in his life, Ronnie honestly considered the afterlife. I'm not a very good person, the man said, looking deep into Ronnie's eyes. He saw deep regret forming on the man's face. I'm not either, Ronnie replied. The man took in a sharp gasp of air and looked past Ronnie into the early afternoon sky. He wore an expression of complete and utter terror on his face. Neither of them said anything for about 30 seconds, the man's expression unchanging. Then he fell back and died. His dead body crushed his bad arm, and the skin attaching to the rest of his body was torn. For a moment, Ronnie just stood there and stared at the dead man, completely ignoring the chaos of the city around him. It felt wrong just leaving him there like that. No one should have to die in an overgrown parking lot with only one arm. Ronnie considered this for a moment. Then he did something truly outrageous. He took off his jacket, a nice $200 one, and placed it over the body. He noticed his empty gun holster. With less consideration than he gave his jacket, he placed the holster on top of the man. "You'll need it more than I will," Ronnie said to no one. As he walked away, he noticed a single wild rose had grown up in between the cracks of the parking lot. Ronnie plucked it and laid it beside the man. Was there anything waiting for us past the great beyond? Ronnie did not know. But after what he'd witnessed, he wanted to believe that there was. He did not want to believe that the culmination of a person's whole existence could be so pathetic and meaningless. This guy lived to be over 60. He had seen a lot of things and meant so much to a lot of people. But this man, with all his moments and experiences, had gone out like a dry fart in the night. But if there was an afterlife, what would it mean for Ronnie, a man who spent his entire professional career killing people for money? Ronnie had been brought out of the moment by the explosion of another gas station, this one closer than the previous. The mysterious ball was still in the sky, and it was still shooting out bolts of lightning. Ronnie figured what he had just experienced was probably happening to at least 100 other people in Las Vegas alone. If this was happening in other places, then the total destruction would be probably unknowable. Ronnie decided that, unless he wanted to see the great beyond firsthand, he should probably get out of the city and into someplace far less populated. He started in the opposite direction of the explosions. He also made an effort to stay off the roads because whatever was happening was making the cars explode. As he was leaving the parking lot, a car violently swung into it. It was heading right towards Ronnie. It swerved out past him at the last second. However, the side of your mirror hit Ronnie hard in the small of his back, knocking him down to the ground. The driver did not stop or slow down or show any interest in stopping or slowing down. Leaving Las Vegas was going to be harder than Ronnie had originally thought. That was when Ronnie heard a small voice. Hey, I have a bunker not too far from here. Do you want to come with me?" Ronnie had heard of several properties in the Las Vegas area that included underground bunkers. He had even seen a tour of one on YouTube. Ronnie turned around and saw a small, bald man with glasses. He was dressed like a doctor. Perhaps he was one. "Yes," Ronnie said without getting up off the ground. The man led Ronnie to the bunker. The entrance was not very far from the overgrown parking lot at all. In fact, it was one of the buildings that had surrounded it. The man explained to Ronnie that in times of crisis it was best to hide in plain sight. Ronnie politely agreed. On the outside, the building looked like a perfectly normal ranch-style home. Perfectly normal, if you ignored all the blood and burn marks from the ensuing apocalypse, that is. After they entered, it still struck Ronnie as more of a vacation home than a bunker. That was until the man removed a patch of carpeting revealing a hatch in the floor. After the man threw open the hatch, Ronnie understood exactly what was going on. The power in the bunker was out, much like the rest of the city. The man, who still had not introduced himself to Ronnie, said that he had a gas-powered generator with the exhaust rig to go outside. "I have no intention of dying in a gas chamber," the man chuckled, "and the lights would go on in no time at all." He should have said that the lights would be on no time soon, because after an hour of fiddling with and swearing at the generator, there was still no power. Ronnie said, "That's all right. That's okay. I was just going to take a nap anyway." "Sounds good," the man said. "The guest room is that way," he pointed. "If you need anything, the master bedroom is this way." He pointed the opposite direction. Ronnie went to his room. When he found the bed, he dragged his hand along the head of it. He noticed that there was a long crack that ran diagonally for about 6 inches. Ronnie figured that with minimal force applied, a wooden stake could be torn from the bed frame. The exact second he laid his head on the pillow, Ronnie was off to dreamland. He was quickly awoken sometime later by a creaking sound. Ronnie jerked up. The moonlight was very minimal, but it was enough. He saw a metallic glint that he recognized immediately. Someone was holding a knife. "Hello?" "Hello?" Ronnie said. Good evening. I just wanted to see how you were doing." It was the bald little doctor. Based on where the knife's reflection was, Ronnie made a brief calculation. He dug his fingernails into the crack in the bed frame. With a wooden squeal, the shard was removed. He had no time to lose. Ronnie hurled the spike in the dark and it hit the man square in the eye. He fell over screaming. I'm sorry, I thought I couldn't trust you, but I saw you had some muscles and I thought you'd be good for food. The man wanted to eat Ronnie. Ronnie pounced on him, slamming down on the wood that was jetting out of the man's eye. And Ronnie said, "You know that cannibalism is a cardinal sin, right?" Ronnie didn't know if this was true, but it didn't seem to matter either way. Ronnie continued to slam down on the wood. Although he could not see it, he could feel the warm blood gushing out of the man's head. Ronnie guessed that if the shard had been made of something stronger, it would most certainly have poked through the other side of the man's skull. After Ronnie was sure that the man was dead, he got up and left the city, and he began walking. As the sun was setting, Ronnie came upon a rest stop. It looked like it still had power. Thank God for small favors. It was still too far away to tell, but it looked like there may have been a few cars in the parking lot. That meant that there would be people there. Although, in his current mood, Ronnie didn't know if he wanted to see any people. 2 people came tumbling out of the rest stop's main entrance. A third followed at a much stabler pace. The third figure was holding a gun and yelling in a language Ronnie could not understand. She fired the gun into the air twice.
あなたを殺します。
The first 2 people yelled, fleeing. At their current pace, it did not take long for them to reach Ronnie. As they passed, one of them turned to look at Ronnie. That woman is fucking crazy. He was holding his hand tightly around his arm. And although it was hard to tell, Ronnie thought that his arm was bleeding. The woman saw Ronnie walking towards her. She yelled,
どこかに行って。
I'm sorry, he said, walking in her direction. I don't understand you. She shouted again,
どこかに行って。
But this time she tucked the gun into her belt and walked towards him. When they had reached each other, they were about 100 feet away from the rest stop. She took out the gun again. Ronnie could now see that it was an old-fashioned revolver, the kind you might see in an old Western movie.
カバンを見せて。
She said. He froze. He had no idea what she was trying to say. She pointed the gun at the bag. Ronnie understood. Sure, no problem. He handed her the bag. She started sifting through it. Ronnie spoke. You can't speak English. She shook her head, not looking up. But you can understand it? She shook her hand. In a so-so gesture, then took out one of the warm cokes and examined it. He saw in her eyes the first expression of emotion, sympathy. She closed the bag and jerked her head in the direction of the rest area. She started walking that way, still holding the bag. He followed. She looked at Ronnie and pointed to herself. Kim. He nodded and repeated her name. Now it was Ronnie's turn. He pointed at himself and said his name. As they entered the building, the first thing Ronnie noticed was that one of the benches had a sleeping bag on it, and there was maps spread out all over the floor. Do you live here? He asked.
ええ、でも私はただ通り過ぎています。
She said as she walked towards one of the maps. She froze in place, then quickly turned around.
すみません。
She said as she ran past him. When they reached the vending machine, she swung the front open like a door. How she got past the lock in the first place, Ronnie would never know. She grabbed a cold Coke from the top shelf and handed it to him.
彼らは冷たい方が美味しい。
Thank you, he nodded in utter confusion. She waved him over to one of the maps. This one was of the continental United States. She turned towards him, racking her brain, trying to think of ways to communicate what she wanted to say. After a moment of intense staring, she sighed. First, she folded her hands under her ear and tilted her head slightly. Sleep? Ronnie guessed. She nodded. Her next part was a bit more of a complex 2-part communique. With both of her index fingers, she pointed to her temples and then to Boston on the nearest map. Ronnie stood back with his hand on his chin. She repeated all 3 steps a few more times until he guessed correctly. When you sleep, you dream of Boston? She nodded with a smile on her face. I guess that's common enough. People dream about all kinds of things. She held out her finger in a one moment gesture. Then she pinched the bridge of her nose as if she had a headache. Ronnie guessed this was her indication that she was thinking. She once again tapped her temples like before. She pointed to Boston on the map, this time following up by pointing at Ronnie. Wait, so what you're saying is I was in your Boston dreams? She nodded again, this time with a solemn expression on her face. Well, that makes things a bit more interesting. He took a sip of his Coke. They were much better cold. She ran to her backpack and took out a black Baby Metal t-shirt. But it was not the picture on the shirt that was important. There was a hole in the left shoulder. Kim pointed to the hole, then out the window at the night sky. Ronnie knew what that meant. You got hit by the magic skyball. She nodded. Do you have any magic powers? He waved his hands back and forth like a jellyfish. She stuck her thumb and forefinger out, then pointed to her temples. A little mind powers.
私はいくつかの考えを読むことができます。しかし、多くはありません。長時間やると疲れます。
What if she can't understand English at all? Ronnie thought to himself. That might have required more than a little mind powers. What if she, not listening to the words he was saying, was listening to the ones he was thinking? These are very interesting questions that he would have no way of knowing the answer to. Up until now, Ronnie had figured that the only powers you could have from the skyball were the exploding kind, but apparently it grounded telepathy as well. Maybe there were others. Perhaps there were some out there that mastering the ability to fly. Kim pointed at herself, then at Ronnie, then at Boston, with a questioning look on her face.
私と一緒にボストンに行きませんか?
You want me to go to Boston with you? Kim nodded. Well, I have to check my calendar, but I think I can make something work. Yes, he nodded back. No, the absurdity of it all was not lost on Ronnie. Was he really about to travel cross-country? Most likely on foot, but who knows? Maybe they could find an ostrich along the way. With a woman who didn't speak English, that he just met at an Arizona rest stop, all because she was saying she was having dreams of him. Sure, why not? It beat walking the desert alone. They stood looking at the map for a moment. Then Ronnie spoke up. Boston is there, he pointed to it on the map, and we're somewhere around here. He pointed to the floor and circled his hand around the northwestern part of Arizona 93. It was hard to know exactly where they were because the rest stop was not on this map. The quickest way would be to travel in a straight northeastern line until they hit the Boston. But that would require going through the Grand Canyon and the Rocky Mountains. That would be disadvantageous. They both understood this, but a word like disadvantageous or
不利
in Kim's case, was very difficult to convey in hand gestures. Kim pointed out U.S. Highway 40, which started a little south of where they were and went across the entire country and ended up in North Carolina. And from there, Ronnie interjected, we can just follow the coast to Boston. Kim gave him a nod of satisfaction. Then we'll leave tomorrow. She nodded again. The next day, after taking as much food and drinks as they could from the vending machines, they set off for Highway 40. They had been traveling along 40 for a few days now. They had just passed through Albuquerque, New Mexico, that previous afternoon. They had built a fire just after sundown and eaten some hot dogs they found at a convenience store. Kim had already gone to sleep, and for reasons unknown to Ronnie, she chose to sleep away from the fire. He didn't know exactly how far she slept, but this did not bother him because they had always found each other by morning. For two people that spoke different languages, they got along quite all right. Ronnie sat by the fire still grazing on his last hot dog. All things considered, the end of the world could have been a lot worse. Ronnie! Kim yelled from the dark. Yeah? He answered. The evil boy kills for pleasure, Kim said. English? Did Kim just speak English? He was so caught up on this that he almost missed what she said. What was that? He asked. No answer. Nice, yeah, that was great. That bombshell, then go back to sleep like nothing happened. I'll talk to her about it tomorrow, Ronnie thought to himself. Maybe her mind was like a radio, picking up weird signals from other people. Thoughts, memories, maybe even dreams. He took a bite from his hot dog and looked up at the stars. The evil boy kills for pleasure. Maybe there was an evil boy out there, somewhere. Could he have been responsible for the skyball? Ronnie didn't think so, but it was not out of the question. He was familiar with the phrase, killing for sport. Wasn't that what he did? No. He only killed the bad guys. At least that's what Chuck would have him believe. He would have been lying if he said he didn't get a rush every time he pulled the trigger. He didn't want to think of this anymore. That felt so long ago. Maybe he could have a fresh start. Oh no, you're not getting off that easy. Just because it's the end of the world doesn't mean you get a clean slate, old buddy, old pal. The word pleasure had certain Freudian connotations to it, such that when the word was preceded by kills for, it painted a disturbing picture. Could this boy have been worse than Ronnie himself? Maybe anything was possible in the end times. Chapter 3. Joshua Patrick was a samurai, smashing the heads off of... No, that's not right. He was the Red Hornet, his favorite superhero, and he was crushing the heads of a group of goons into the brick wall. Slap! Slap! Crack! Alright, that's enough lettuce, Josh. His boss told him, as Josh came plummeting back into reality. A quick and easy way to remove the stem from a bulb of lettuce was to hit it against a table or other surface. This didn't damage the lettuce leaves in any way, and the stem just slid out nicely. That's right. He was not a samurai or a superhero. No, he was just a kid working at a meaningless fast food restaurant in a meaningless little town in East Texas. Whatever. Josh shrugged. My shift is almost over anyway. That's right, the manager agreed. Who's picking you up this time? Ted. He was Josh's brother-in-law. Ted was picking Josh up from work because Josh's parents were dead and his sister Janine was sick. So Ted was the only one left. If Josh had his way, he would rather have just walked home, although if given the opportunity, he might just throw himself into oncoming traffic. Josh walked out of the revolving door. He always thought that was an excellent metaphor for the fast food industry, but his restaurant had a literal revolving door. Ted's car was parked right in front. As Josh hopped into the truck that he would spend the next week or so of his life living out of, Ted turned to him and said, Janine wants me to talk to you about your phone background. But I don't understand, Josh said as he walked to the front door of his sister's ranch-style home. Why is it okay that Michelle can be so obsessed with Captain America, but it's seen as unmoral for me to have a drawing of Ramona Flowers as my phone background? Ted was very annoyed with his adolescent brother-in-law. On top of all this, it was a very hot day in East Texas, and Ted could feel a particularly unfriendly headache brewing in the back of his mind. He had zero capacity to argue with a teenager. Listen, Josh, I don't get it either. Just take it up with Janine. It was her rule anyway. It had almost been 1 year since Ted and Janine had married, and a little less than that since Josh's parents had died in a plane crash. It was their 25th wedding anniversary, and their father had so wanted to see the Rocky Mountains from the bird's eye view. Unfortunately, their pilot was just a tad too cocky, and their view of the Rockies ended up slightly more up close and personal than the couple had originally intended. Back to now. Josh stormed off to his room and slammed the door in a teenage fit of rage. Ted couldn't help but smile at this. There was unrest in the Middle East, the Amazon rainforests were on fire, there were babies in Congress, but the biggest issue of our lifetime was the wallpaper on Josh's phone. Ted went to the kitchen to make himself a cup of coffee. He doubted that coffee would help his headache at all. In fact, he remembered hearing somewhere, perhaps it might have been Janine's mother, that coffee made headaches worse. But that didn't really seem to matter to Ted. He liked coffee, and that was okay. Janine was probably taking a nap. For the past few days, she had been running a fever of 102. After his coffee, Ted would go in and check on her. Earlier that afternoon, before Ted went to pick up Josh from work, Janine seemed like she was really beating the old bug, and that, too, was okay. Ted walked into their bedroom. "Hello, sugar bugger," he said. "Hello." Janine was sitting up, a good sign, and reading a paperback. It was a romance novel titled Misery's Baby, written by Penny W. Eyes. It was the kind of book that Ted did not much care for. The cover image depicted a very muscular man, sans shirt, obviously, probably in his early 30s, with his arms around a young woman who couldn't be a second over 19. Perfectly street legal, as the boys would say. Despite the book's title, there were 0 babies visible on the cover. Not that this man and woman would have any issues remedying that problem in about 9 months' time. "Hey, hon," she said, closing the book, but saving her spot with her index and middle fingers. "How are you feeling?" Ted asked her. "I'm feeling better," she nodded. As if to underline the statement, she took a tissue from the box on her bedside table and blew a massive wad of snot into it. This, to Ted, sounded better and more intelligible than any jazz he had ever heard in his life. Ted took a moment to admire the cool breeze that had just picked up, the way it was softly blew the curtains about, and the refreshing smells it carried. This was the last truly happy moment that crossed Ted's mind. Before Ted's thoughts were even finished, a bolt of what looked like pure fire shot through the window. Then it turned at a perfect right angle and struck Janine square in the chest, setting her shirt ablaze. Immediately, the paperback she was reading caught fire and went soaring across the room, exploding the armoire that Ted's cousin had given them for their wedding present. The bolt had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, and now Janine's body was trembling all over. "What's happening to me?" she asked. I don't know," Ted yelled. He ran to her side and grabbed her forearm. He felt a tingling sensation, not dissimilar to carbonated bubbles running up and down her arm. After holding on for a few seconds, he was flung backwards by an invisible force, leaving a crater in the wall. This wall, along with every other wall in their house, had been painted by Janine's parents shortly after the newlyweds had moved in. Her eyes and mouth started glowing bright yellow. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening." "It's okay." He got back to the place on her forearm where his hands had been. Her skin was quickly dissolving. It was at this moment that Ted Matthews realized that the situation was in fact not okay. All over her body, skin was giving way to muscle, and muscle to organs and nerves and blood vessels, and in some places even bone. Janine's face bore the expression of someone that knew she didn't have much time. "I love you, Ted," she said, looking into her husband's eyes. She was crying, but her tears were evaporating before they could even reach the base of her nose. "I love you too, Janine," he answered his wife. But before he finished talking, her eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. Her chest imploded, and a massive shockwave shot out from her dead body, breaking every window in the house. The force sent her head rolling off her neck. It landed in the newly formed crevice in her midsection. Ted got to his feet and surveyed the body of his headless wife. After a moment of silent shock, he screamed. The screaming continued for almost 2 hours, and although he did not leave his room, Josh could surmise what had happened because a similar thing had happened to him. Because Josh was younger and healthier, the results were quite different. Right after he was hit by a bolt of electric fire, he accidentally set his My Hero Academia poster that hung on the door on fire, which was mildly infuriating. After that, he felt extremely lightheaded for almost a minute. That was when the screaming started. Since then, he had felt a strange feeling that he enjoyed very much. If he had grown up anywhere other than East Texas, he would have known that this feeling was what the kids referred to as high out of your G-dang mind. By now, he had completely forgotten about his poster. He was so enamored with his newfound powers, he immediately hopped onto Reddit to see if this had happened to anyone else. Sure enough, it looked like this was happening all over the world. It was still very unclear, however. It looked like one out of 4 people got lucky. It looked like a good portion of the people that got it could not handle it and died. This is probably what happened to his sister. A moment of silence for Janine. A lot of the major cities were in shambles because of this. However, it looked like Las Vegas had been hit the hardest. Sin City finally got what it deserved, Josh thought. For now, people were not totally sure as to the extent of these powers. Most people were saying that they could shoot energy out of their hands. Some said they could even read minds. Few people even said they could fly. Mostly, everyone agreed that more uses for these powers would be discovered in the coming days. That was about the time that Ted knocked on the bedroom door. Josh spun around too quickly and tripped over a pair of shoes he had forgot to pick up. The new power would take a bit of getting used to. Josh was still lying on the ground when he said, "Come in." Ted opened the door. He was so upset at the death of his wife, he hardly seemed surprised to see Josh on the floor. He started, "Jen," before stopping and covering his face with his hands. "Your sister is dead." "So I heard," Josh said without any real sympathy as he got to his feet. "There was this bolt of," Ted said, before getting interrupted by Josh. "A bolt of fire. Yeah, the same thing happened here." Josh pointed to the open window as if that indicated anything. Then he made his hands glow green. Ted yelled, "No! Don't you ever do that in front of me again. I just saw my wife get killed by whatever this is." Josh immediately interrupted him again, very nonchalantly. "There isn't technically a name for it yet, but I heard on Reddit that people are calling today M-Day." Ted looked at Josh as if he was speaking a language he didn't understand. "Red? It?" "No," Josh said, starting to get very annoyed. "Reddit, one word. It's an internet forum. You know what? It doesn't matter. People online are saying it's happening all over the world." "How come you and your sister both got hit, but she died and you didn't?" "People who are older, sicker, or otherwise weaker tend to have a lower chance of survival. Finally, understanding seemed to dawn on Ted's face, but that quickly gave way to an even greater level of concern. My sister Alex, she lives in Boston. She has cancer. I need to find out if she's okay. Ted, you were so close. There's literal magic in the world, and you're worried about your dying sister. Although Josh did not say this out loud, some of it may have been communicated through his facial expressions, because Ted responded by asking, "What's your problem?" The truth is simple enough. Magic exists. Let the dead bury their dead. Ted's face became as red as a burning rose. Don't quote the Bible to me. You haven't even gone to church in over a month. He had paused for a moment. Pack your bags. We're going to Boston. Wait, what? Josh yelled. You realize cell phones still work, right? You can just call her. Don't I even have a choice in the matter? Ted had already started walking away, but at this he turned around. Yeah, I know. Even if she is dead, there's nothing left for us here. I'm now your legal guardian. You have to come with me. Josh fumed. You're not understanding the situation. There's finally magic. Real magic in the world. The legal system doesn't matter anymore. This time, Ted didn't turn around. You're coming with me to Boston. Oh, and one more thing. You're not going to be using your magic powers at all when you're around me, so you can go ahead and forget you ever got them in the first place. Ted was partly right. There was nothing for them in East Texas, so Josh decided it wasn't bad to play along and go to Boston. Who knew? They might run into some other magic users along the way. They could become Josh's new family, because God knew Josh needed one of those. Chapter 4. Although Rachel Smith and Trish Baker never actually met Tony Masters in this life or the next, the two women did have a massive impact on his life, or, more bluntly, they played a hand in ending his life. Rachel Smith was a pilot for Lone Star Airlines, and she happened to be flying over Minneapolis on M-Day. Trish Baker was a police officer in Minneapolis. She had just graduated from the academy 2 months prior. She was, as the boys and girls in blue would say, still very green. Tony Masters was a hotshot movie producer who owned a large penthouse in Minneapolis, with view of the entire city, although this was not his primary residence. You could probably figure out what happened next. Rachel was flying over the city, about to land her airplane at the airport, when she saw it. She had never seen a UFO before, although she had heard plenty of stories of people, mostly fellow pilots, who claimed to have seen them, so she was more than ecstatic to call this one. That was when it struck. First bolt shot right through the windshield, which created a vacuum. Rachel was wearing her seatbelt, but her co-pilot was not. He got sucked out as the door that separated the cockpit from the rest of the airplane was incinerated by the blast. The second bolt curved around the plane and struck through one of the windows just above the left wing. The ensuing blast was enough to remove the wing completely. It crashed down on the highway below. Rachel turned the plane sideways in order to compensate for the missing wing. This turned the whole plane around in a kind of U-turn back over the city. During all of this, the plane was also descending, so much so that Rachel could see the city traffic below. She saw a police car turn its lights on. Rachel had enough time to think to herself, a load of good that'll do. That was when the plane crashed into one of the skyscrapers, sending it smashing down and obliterating most of downtown Minneapolis. Trish Baker had the patrol car all to herself. She dropped her partner off a few blocks back to pick up some donuts. Yes, this was technically against protocol, but no one seemed to mind, and it was only for a couple minutes anyway. Trish's job was pretty straightforward. She was to stay in the car, not engaging with anyone, and if she saw anything suspicious, she was to call it a dispatch, and they would find someone more capable to deal with it. Trish never actually saw the skyball, but she did see the effects of it. The airplane that looked like a massive one-winged angel, for example. Luckily, it was headed away from her. Wait, no, scratch that, it was headed right for her. Trish did a quick U-turn of her own and drove as fast as she could away from the plane. She turned her lights and sirens on, not because she thought it would change the situation at all, but because it made her feel a little better. And if she was going to die today, she was going to make it as comfortable as possible. It was not the plane that killed her. It was a skyscraper that landed on the roof of her patrol car and crushed her to death. Tony Masters was supposed to be on vacation, and he was, but that had been until Jessica Chastain's agent called to tell Tony that Jessica would be stepping down from the lead role of Tony's upcoming movie. It was to be based on a novel called Joanna, written by some guy in New England, but that was not important. For a supporting role in Saturday Night Live's feature-length parody of The Avengers. Tony tried to offer her more money, but the agent did what most agents do best. He didn't budge. Tony was just finishing his 5th glass of bourbon, and if he didn't have another one soon, he might just jump off the balcony and faceplant right down into the busy traffic. As he poured himself another glass, and hearing what the agent was saying but not really listening to him, the skyball appeared. From his high-rise window, he had a nearly unobstructed view of the strange thing. His first thought after seeing it was that it must be some kind of experimental marketing stunt. Oh, the crazy things people convince themselves to believe. Tony never saw the plane crash into the building, so the loud crash and the sudden falling caught him off guard. So did the impact of the building as it completely flattened downtown. If Trish had not turned the lights on her cop car on, Rachel might not have gotten distracted at the crucial moment and she might have missed the building, sparing Tony's life. Or maybe not. Who's to say? Chapter 5. The sitting president only made it 2 years into his term before M-Day. Not that anyone would miss him. Not that anyone could tell the difference between him and the 10 previous inhabitants of the People's House. Was he one of the ones who had been a lawyer before he held the Oval Office? Or maybe he'd been the one who was chilling out in the Senate since 1954. One thing was for sure, he wasn't one of the Hollywood presidents. At least they had been entertaining. M-Day in Washington, D.C. started like any other day in Washington, D.C. He sat at his desk thinking of ways to take advantage of as many people as possible, either by working with the law or by going around it. That was when the head of security, John Paul George, came bursting in through the door. "Mr. President, we have a situation." "Oh, JP." Mr. President leaned back, his hands folded over his chin. "It's always one situation after the next. What's it now, son? Speak up." John Paul was hunched over with his hands on his knees. He could run a long distance to deliver this message. "Sir, there's something in the sky." The president sat up straight, on the back of his chair, acting like a slingshot. "Is that all you came this way to tell me? Go call the Air Force or something. I got better things to attend to." He clicked his pen in annoyance. "Well, that's just it, sir. The Air Force called us." As if to underline this point, a bolt of electric fire shot through the window of the Oval Office, hitting John Paul square in the chest. The president was sitting with his back to the window when it exploded, so most of the shards caught in the back of his big, leather-bound chair. Had he not been in the chair, he surely would have been killed by one of the glass shards, and this story may have ended differently. The beam had burned a hole in John Paul's shirt, revealing his jacked pecs and abs. Mr. President had enough time to wonder if his good old pal John Paul had been juicing, because you couldn't get that fit unless you were on the magic sauce. John Paul froze for a moment before taking a deep breath. That was when he said the magic words. "Sir, we believe this has been an act of terrorism." Terrorism. He thought that there was someone out there that cared enough about him to want to try and kill him. That was what got him up in the morning. Neither of them needed to say a word. They both knew they were headed to the bunker. That's what Mr. President always pictured in his mind, the capital B, bunker. As they were walking, they passed another member of the president's security detail. "You," the president yelled without stopping. "Go get Oliver and take him to the bunker." "Yes, sir. Right away, sir," Dunderling said, before quickly scurrying away. "Was it the Chinese?" the president said, looking deep into John Paul's eyes. Or maybe the Russians? Or, no, probably the North Koreans. By now they had reached the library and were standing before a large shelf of books. John Paul got to his knees and pulled out a book from the bottom of the shelf called The Microorganisms That Live Within Sharks by Daniel B. Greene. At this, the shelf had slid back violently with a silent whiz, revealing a small elevator. They both entered it. "Hey, maybe it's the Canadians. Their PM, that French guy, I don't even remember his name. He can be pretty sneaky." John Paul, who himself was Canadian, said nothing. He valued his job's security more than his ethnic heritage. The elevator only had 2 buttons. Mr. President had pressed the button that corresponded to the bunker. John Paul leaned against the far wall. With a hiss and a jolt, they began their descent. John Paul nearly lost his footing. "You all right, soldier?" The president turned in John Paul's direction. "I'm all right, sir." John Paul braced himself in the corner, just a little lightheaded is all. It was a little bit more than lightheadedness. When he got hit by the beam that burned his shirt, it seemed to have somehow rewired his brain. Also, the turbulent velocity of the elevator was making him dizzy. The bunker was 1,000 feet underground, almost directly below the Oval Office. In every other sense, however, the bunker and the Oval Office were functionally identical. Because even though the president was underground, didn't mean that his work stopped. As the saying went, the show must go on. The bunker was a small circle-shaped room. Its only furnishings were a table and 7 chairs around it. The biggest chair, the one in the middle, the only one that had a desktop computer, obviously belonged to El Presidente. "Where's Oliver?" he asked, sitting down in his chair. John Paul was unsure if the president was talking to him or someone else on the desktop computer. So at first he didn't answer. When the president glanced up at him, John Paul spoke up. He was behind us, sir. That means he's likely going to be coming down through there." He pointed at the door, which was on the opposite side of the door they had come in. The president leaned back. "Very good." Neither of them said anything for a few minutes, although to John Paul it felt closer to an hour. Then the door slid open. Oliver Trelawney, the Vice President of the United States of America, walked out. John Paul was frozen in place. This had not been the same Oliver he saw yesterday. That Oliver had been very calm, timid even, and very agreeable. That was how he landed his job, after all. This Oliver was none of those things. There was something serpentine about the way he moved. His body had been hunched over in a conniving sort of way, and had his hair grown a whole inch since John Paul saw him last? That was nonsensical, but it looked as though it had, as the tips hung down past his earlobes. Also, he wasn't wearing a shirt, and he was nowhere near as jacked as John Paul, but for a man of his age, his physique was nothing to blow your nose at. As John Paul was taking in all of this, Oliver slinked over to the elevator. "Good afternoon, Mr. President," Oliver said, his voice sounding like someone who had been smoking since before he was born. The president turned in his chair to face him. Oliver cocked his hand back, the way someone would right before they threw a baseball. As he did this, an orange ball of light appeared in his hand. He threw it. The ball made contact with the president's head, removing it from the rest of his body. Instantly, the ball carried his head across the room, shattering gray-red mist on the bunker's far side wall. John Paul screamed, "Mr. President!" A deep purple smoke escaped the body of the man formerly known as the leader of the free world. Oliver Trelawney inhaled it with a smile. "I'm the president now," Oliver said. His head remained totally still, but his eyes moved to John Paul. Now John Paul had his gun out and was pointed it at Oliver. He was shaking so much that the tip of the weapon formed the shape of a V in the air. "You have it too?" Oliver said as he walked towards John Paul, never breaking eye contact. "I don't know what you mean," John Paul said, still shaking. "It takes one to know one, old friend." As he said this, he stuck out his open hand, and a greenish yellow electricity danced around his fingertips. Oliver motioned to the hole in John Paul's shirt. By now, he was totally speechless. He could only nod. "All right, I have a proposition for you. Either we walk out of here and rule the new world together, or I kill you and swallow your soul." When he said, "swallow your soul," he jerked his head back to the president's headless corpse. "So what do you say, old boy?" I think, what do you think?" "I'll go with you." "Good man." Oliver squeezed John Paul's shoulder and then walked towards the elevator. "I think this is the start of a magical relationship." John Paul pressed the button that opened the elevator door. It slid open. He held out his hand. "Last call on the magical mystery tour." Ultimately, John Paul went with everything because he valued his job security above all else.